At 08:14 hours on August 7, 1942, Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai climbed into the cockpit of his Mitsubishi, a 6M0 at Rabaul, New Britain, preparing for a mission that would shatter everything he believed about his enemy. The tropical heat was already oppressive, the air thick with humidity and the smell of aviation fuel. Sakai had performed his pre-flight checks with the meticulous care that had kept him alive through years of combat. He checked his control surfaces, tested the movement of his stick, confirmed the ammunition loads in his two 20mm cannons and pair of 7.7mm machine guns. Everything was perfect, as it always was. Sakai was 25 years old, a veteran of combat over China, the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. He had already shot down dozens of Allied aircraft. His hands were steady, his confidence absolute. He came from samurai lineage, his ancestors having fought in Japan's wars for centuries. The warrior code of Bushido ran through his veins. The Americans, he had been told, were soft, decadent, incapable of standing against the warrior spirit of Japan. They were a nation of merchants and pleasure seekers, lacking the discipline and fortitude that defined true fighting men. That morning he would discover how catastrophically wrong that assessment was. The mission was to intercept American forces landing on an island called Guadalcanal. Word had reached Rabaul that morning of a massive American amphibious operation, the first major offensive action by the United States since the war began. Sakai and his fellow pilots of the Tainan Air Group had been scrambled to attack the landing force and provide cover for Japanese bombers striking the American fleet. It would be the first time Sakai faced American Navy pilots in combat. He had fought American Army pilots over the Philippines and found them brave but outmatched by superior Japanese aircraft and tactics. Navy. Pilots, he had heard, were different. They were supposed to be the best the Americans had, trained specifically for carrier operations, the elite of their air service. His squadron commander, Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, gathered the pilots before takeoff. The morning sun cast long shadows across the packed earth of the airfield as the aviators stood in formation. "Be careful," Sasai warned. "These are regular American Navy fighters, not Army planes. This is the first time we will be meeting them. They are probably the best opponents we will face. Never lose sight of my plane." Sasai's brother-in-law, Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Toshiro, was a flying boat officer stationed at Tulagi, directly in the path of the American landing. His fate was already sealed, though they did not know it yet. Within hours, American forces would overwhelm the Japanese garrison there. Sakai climbed into his cockpit, pulled the canopy closed, and began his takeoff roll. The Zero lifted off the runway and climbed into the morning sky, joining formation with the other fighters. Below, the green jungle of New Britain stretched to the horizon. Ahead lay 600 miles of open ocean, and an enemy that would prove far more formidable than any Japanese pilot had been led to believe. What happened over the next several hours would mark the beginning of a profound transformation in how Japanese pilots understood their American adversaries. A transformation that would unfold across 3 brutal years of Pacific warfare, one dogfight at a time. The beliefs that Japanese pilots carried into World War II did not emerge from thin air. They were the product of decades of deliberate cultivation, a carefully constructed worldview that placed Japan at the center of a racial and spiritual hierarchy that military leaders believed would guarantee victory against any Western power. Japanese military doctrine in 1941 rested on a concept called Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit. This was not merely patriotism. It was a quasi-religious belief that Japanese soldiers possessed an innate spiritual superiority that would overcome any material disadvantage. Spirit would triumph over steel. Will would defeat technology. The divine essence of the Japanese race, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu herself, made victory inevitable against spiritually inferior opponents. This belief had deep roots in Japanese history and culture. The warrior class, the samurai, had dominated Japanese society for centuries. Their code of Bushido emphasized honor, loyalty unto death, and contempt for enemies who surrendered rather than fight to the end. When Japan modernized in the late 19th century, These samurai values were deliberately grafted onto the new conscript army. Every Japanese soldier was taught to see himself as a spiritual heir to the samurai, regardless of his actual ancestry. The concept received its ultimate validation in 1905, when Japan defeated Imperial Russia in a war that shocked the Western world. A small Asian nation had humbled one of the great European powers. Japanese military theorists concluded that their victory proved the superiority of spirit over mere material resources. Russia had more men, more ships, more industry. Japan had Yamato Damashi. Spirit had won. Military propaganda reinforced these ideas relentlessly in the decades that followed. American soldiers were portrayed as weak, materialistic, and lacking any warrior tradition. Japanese newspapers and films depicted them as a nation of frightened housewives, labor agitators, and greedy businessmen who would crumble at the first sign of serious resistance. One popular wartime film showed American soldiers as morally decadent and physically weak devils, incapable of standing against the purity and virtue of Japanese warriors. The armed forces were told that American forces would not come to fight them, that Americans could not fight in the jungle and indeed could not stand warfare of any kind. Accounts of prisoners of war depicted the Americans as cowardly and willing to do anything to gain favor with their captors. Subordinates were actively encouraged to treat prisoners contemptuously, to foster feelings of superiority toward them. This contempt extended specifically to American pilots. Before the war, some Japanese military theorists argued that Americans made poor aviators because they lacked the discipline and spiritual fortitude required for aerial combat. One pre-war analysis suggested that Americans had a defective sense of balance that made them unsuitable for flying. The American love of comfort, of safety, of individual preservation over collective duty would make them hesitant in battle. They would break and run when confronted with true warriors who did not fear death. Japanese pilot training reinforced this superiority complex through a selection and education process that was among the most rigorous in the world. The program was brutally selective, accepting only the most exceptional candidates from thousands of applicants. A young man hoping to become a naval aviator had to pass a series of examinations that eliminated all but a tiny fraction of those who applied. Those who made it into the program faced years of intensive training. The curriculum lasted 2 to 3 years and produced aviators with 700 hours or more of flight time before they ever saw combat. Pilots practiced gunnery, navigation, formation flying, and acrobatics until the skills became instinctive. They learned to push their aircraft to the absolute limits of performance. The training was also physically brutal. Recruits were severely beaten with rattan sticks for the slightest perceived infractions. Saburo Sakai later described it in stark terms. "I remember sometimes passing out from the blows. The body and mind can take only so much punishment. When a recruit passed out, they would throw cold water on him to revive him, then continue the beating. We were to suffer in silence. Period." By contrast, American pilots at the war's beginning often had far less experience. The peacetime American military had been small, its pilot training programs limited in scale. Many American pilots who would face the Japanese in the opening months of the war had only a few hundred hours of flight time. Some had even less. Japanese veterans looked at their American counterparts and saw inexperienced boys in inferior aircraft. The assessment seemed reasonable based on the evidence available. American pre-war fighter designs, aircraft like the P-36 and the F-2 Buffalo, were clearly outclassed by the Zero. Japanese pilots who had tested captured American planes confirmed their inferiority. Everything pointed to an easy victory. The early months of the war seemed to confirm every Japanese assumption. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, one victory followed another with stunning speed. Japanese Zeros dominated the skies, shooting down American P-40 Warhawks, P-39 Airacobras, and F-2 Buffaloes with apparent ease. In the Philippines, Japanese pilots destroyed most of the American Air Force on the ground in the opening attacks and swept aside what remained in aerial combat. The kill ratios were overwhelmingly favorable. American pilots who survived early encounters described the Zero as nearly invincible, a fighter that could outclimb, outturn, and outmaneuver anything in the Allied arsenal. For Japanese aviators, this success bred what historians would later call victory disease. They became convinced that their string of triumphs validated everything they had been taught about racial and spiritual superiority. The Americans were exactly as weak as propaganda had promised. The war would be won quickly, and Japan would take its rightful place as the dominant power in Asia. Then came Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima was one of Japan's most experienced fighter leaders. He had flown combat since the war with China and commanded some of the Imperial Navy's finest pilots. On a mission over Guadalcanal in August 1942, Nakajima encountered something that made him return to Rabaul in a rage. He had gotten on the tail of an American F4F Wildcat easily enough. The Wildcat was slower than his Zero, less maneuverable, an inferior aircraft by every measure that mattered. Nakajima lined up his shot, preparing to add another kill to his record. Then something unexpected happened. A second Wildcat came roaring at him from the side. Nakajima had to break off his attack. He tried to re-engage, but every time he closed on one American, the other would swing around to threaten him. The two Wildcats kept weaving back and forth, protecting each other, denying him any clean shot. For the first time in his combat career, Nakajima was forced to dive away and run for safety. Saburo Sakai witnessed similar encounters. He later described the confusion among Japanese pilots when they first faced this tactic. For the first time, Lieutenant Commander Nakajima encountered what was to become a famous double-team maneuver on the part of the enemy. Two Wildcats jumped on the commander's plane. He had no trouble getting on the tail of an enemy fighter, but never had a chance to fire before the Grumman's teammate roared at him from the side. What the Japanese pilots had encountered was the Thach Weave, a defensive tactic developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thach of the United States Navy. Thach had heard intelligence reports about the Zero's extraordinary capabilities before he ever faced one in combat. A Fleet Air Tactical Unit Intelligence Bulletin dated September 22, 1941, had described the new Japanese fighter's extraordinary maneuverability and climb rate. The Zero could climb at over 5,000 feet per minute and execute turns that would stall most American fighters. Rather than accept that the Zero was unbeatable, Thach spent evenings at his dining room table in Coronado, California, working with matchsticks to devise a counter. He would arrange the matches to represent aircraft, moving them through imaginary combat scenarios, trying to find a way to neutralize the Zero's advantages. Night after night he experimented, testing and discarding ideas until he found something that worked. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. Two fighters would fly in a wide formation, separated by enough distance that an attacking enemy could not engage both simultaneously. When a Zero attacked one, both Americans would turn toward each other in a series of weaving maneuvers. The Zero, focused on its target, would suddenly find itself crossing through the path of the second Wildcat. The Japanese pilot had to either break off his attack or risk being shot down from an unexpected angle. Thach called it the beam defense position. It would become known to history as the Thach Weave. The tactic required something that Japanese pilots initially dismissed as a weakness: teamwork over individual glory. Japanese training emphasized personal skill, the lone warrior proving his worth through individual combat like the samurai of old. Pilots sought to build personal kill records, to be recognized as aces, to bring honor to their families through individual achievement. American training increasingly emphasized mutual support, protecting your wingman above all else, subordinating individual glory to collective survival. Thach tested his tactic in practice with fellow pilot Butch O'Hare before either had seen combat against the Zero. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Thach had his first chance to try it against actual Japanese fighters. His flight of 6 Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3 on the USS Yorktown was escorting torpedo bombers when they were bounced by 15 to 20 Zeros. The situation should have been hopeless. The Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, and outnumbered the Wildcats by at least 3 to 1. One Wildcat was immediately set ablaze. Another had its radio knocked out. Thach was down to 4 fighters against a swarm of Japanese planes. He initiated the weave with his wingman, Ensign Ram Dib. The inexperienced Dib followed the pattern they had practiced, turning toward Thach when a Zero latched onto his tail. Thach watched the enemy fighter slide into position behind his wingman. With so many enemy planes in the air, he was not sure anything would work. Then the Zero followed Dib through his turn, exactly as Thach had predicted. Thach found himself nose-on to the Japanese fighter, its belly exposed as it concentrated on Dib. He pressed the trigger and held it down. The Zero burst into flames. The pattern repeated throughout the engagement. Zeros that had expected easy kills found themselves caught in crossing fire. The Weave frustrated their attacks, denying them the clean shots they were accustomed to achieving against isolated American fighters. The tactic could not win the battle outright, but it could save lives. Sakai himself came to recognize this difference. In a post-war interview, he acknowledged what he had witnessed. "I am confident that Japanese pilots were superior on a one-on-one basis," he said, "but the ability to work as a team, both offensively and defensively, that the Americans had was very impressive. Perhaps this comes from the team's spirit and thinking they developed playing American football. This hit us particularly hard in the air engagements from the middle of the war onwards. They all wanted to win. Combat makes the pilots' will to win stronger. With every fight, they became much stronger." That observation cut to the heart of something Japanese pilots struggled to understand. The Americans were not fighting as individuals seeking honor. They were fighting as a coordinated unit seeking victory, and they were getting better at it every day. On the same day Nakajima raged back to Rabaul, Saburo Sakai had his own encounter that would haunt him for years. The sky over Guadalcanal was chaos. Japanese bombers were making their runs on the American fleet, while Zeros tangled with defending fighters. Smoke rose from burning ships in the harbor below. The sound of gunfire crackled across the radio frequencies. Sakai had already scored hits on several enemy aircraft when he spotted what he thought was a formation of American fighters. He counted 8 aircraft flying in formation, their distinctive silhouette suggesting F6F Wildcats. Easy prey for an experienced Zero pilot who caught them from behind. Sakai banked his Zero and moved to attack, climbing slightly to gain a height advantage before diving on the unsuspecting Americans. As he closed, he realized his mistake. The aircraft were not Wildcats. They were SBD Dauntless dive bombers, each with a rear gunner armed with twin 30-caliber machine guns specifically designed to fend off attacking fighters. Sakai had flown directly into a hornet's nest. The Dauntless gunners opened fire simultaneously. A storm of 30-caliber bullets tore into Sakai's cockpit. The noise was overwhelming, metal striking metal, the crack of rounds passing through the canopy. Sakai felt impacts all around him. One round struck him in the head. The bullet destroyed his goggles, creased his skull, and exited through his forehead. The impact blinded him instantly in his right eye and left him unable to see from his left due to blood pouring into it. Half his body went numb with paralysis as the nerves were damaged. His Zero, suddenly unpiloted, rolled into a dive toward the ocean far below. The pain was indescribable. Sakai later compared it to having his head split open with an axe. He could not see, could not move properly, could barely think through the agony. Blood covered his face and filled his mouth. The altimeter was unwinding rapidly as his plane dove toward the water. By any reasonable measure, Sakai should have died. The wound was catastrophic, the kind that kills instantly or leaves a pilot too incapacitated to do anything but crash. He was hundreds of miles from base over open ocean, surrounded by enemy aircraft, flying a damaged plane with failing systems. Most pilots would have simply crashed into the sea. Many would have been unconscious before they hit the water. Sakai did not give up. Fighting through waves of agony and disorientation, he regained partial control of his aircraft. His right hand still worked, and he could feel the stick. He pulled back, arresting the dive just above the wave tops. The Zero leveled out, skimming the ocean's surface. He could not see to navigate. He could barely remain conscious. But he knew the rough direction back to Rabaul, and he knew that if he flew long enough in that direction he might find land. He set his heading by dead reckoning, pointed his battered Zero southwest, and began the longest flight of his life. For 4 hours and 47 minutes, Sakai flew his damaged fighter 640 miles across open ocean. He fought to stay awake, biting his lip until it bled, slapping himself with his working hand, doing anything to keep from passing out. The blood in his left eye occasionally cleared enough for him to glimpse his instruments before more blood obscured them again. Several times he considered giving up. The pain was unbearable. The distance seemed impossible. He was dying and he knew it. But something kept him going, some combination of training, pride, and sheer stubbornness that refused to let him die in the water. When he finally reached Rabaul, he nearly crashed into a line of parked aircraft. He circled the field 4 times, his fuel gauge reading empty, trying to line up an approach with one barely functional eye. On his second attempt, he managed to put his Zero down on the runway. Ground crews rushed to his aircraft, horrified by what they saw. Sakai's face was a mask of blood. His canopy was shot through with holes. The plane itself was riddled with damage that should have sent it tumbling into the sea. But Sakai was not finished. After landing, he refused medical treatment until he had made his formal mission report to his commanding officer. He struggled out of his cockpit, stood at attention despite his wounds, and delivered his report with military precision. Only then did he allow medics to take him. The wound ended Sakai's frontline combat career for nearly 2 years. The bullet had permanently destroyed the vision in his right eye. The left eye, though eventually recovering, would never be quite the same. The paralysis gradually faded, but the psychological scars would last forever. But before he was evacuated to Japan for surgery and rehabilitation, he had time to reflect on what had happened over Guadalcanal. The Americans had not broken. They had not run. They had fought with a tenacity and skill that Japanese propaganda had insisted was impossible. Their gunners had stood their ground and shot accurately even as Zero fighters bore down on them. And they had shot him down. The daily air battles over Guadalcanal forced a slow, painful recalibration in how Japanese pilots thought about their enemy. The Marines flying from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal were not elite pilots by peacetime standards. Many had minimal combat experience. Some had arrived at the island barely qualified to fly their aircraft in combat conditions. Their Wildcats were demonstrably inferior to the Zero in most performance categories, slower by perhaps 15 miles per hour, less maneuverable in every axis, unable to climb or turn with the Japanese fighter. On paper, every engagement should have been a Japanese victory. None of that mattered as much as Japanese pilots had assumed. The Americans had advantages that did not show up in aircraft specifications. Their planes were ruggedly built, constructed to survive damage that would destroy a Zero. A Wildcat could absorb dozens of hits from Japanese machine guns and keep flying. Its pilot sat behind armor plating that stopped bullets that would have killed him in a Japanese aircraft. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, designed to close around bullet holes rather than leak fuel that could ignite. Japanese designers had sacrificed all of that for performance, making the Zero light and agile but terribly vulnerable to enemy fire. A single well-placed burst from a Wildcat's .650 caliber machine guns could send a Zero spiraling down in flames. The Japanese pilot had no armor to protect him, no self-sealing tanks to prevent a fire. The same aircraft that made him nearly untouchable in a dogfight made him fatally vulnerable if an enemy ever got a clean shot. More importantly, the American tactical system was evolving rapidly, adapting to the realities of combat against a superior aircraft. Pilots who survived their first engagements learned hard lessons and applied them. Intelligence officers debriefed them thoroughly after every mission, identified what worked and what failed, and spread successful tactics across the force. When one pilot discovered an effective counter to a Japanese maneuver, that knowledge was documented, analyzed, and disseminated to every squadron in the theater. The Americans developed new rules for engaging Zeros. Never try to dogfight them at low speed. Never follow them in a climb. Never chase a Zero that seems to be running away, because it might be setting up a reversal. Instead, use altitude advantage. Dive on them from above, make one pass, and climb away before they can respond. Fight in pairs, always protecting your wingman. Accept that your aircraft is slower and less maneuverable, and find ways to turn those weaknesses into strengths. The Japanese system worked differently. Individual glory was prized over institutional learning. Ace pilots were celebrated in newspapers and on the radio, their faces appearing on posters and cigarette cards, their techniques discussed in reverent tones. But those techniques often died with them. There was little systematic effort to capture and spread tactical innovations across the force. Veteran pilots were kept in combat until they were killed or disabled, rather than rotated home to train replacements and share what they had learned. The consequences became apparent in the attrition statistics. Japan lost 36 aircraft over Guadalcanal in the first 2 days of combat. The Americans lost 19, many to accidents rather than enemy action. That ratio held roughly steady through months of fighting. Japanese pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced, and each loss took with it years of irreplaceable training and experience. By late 1942, some Japanese pilots began to express concerns that filtered back through intelligence reports and private conversations. The Americans were not fighting the way propaganda had promised. They were not cowards who would break at the first sign of resistance. They did not freeze in panic when engaged by superior aircraft. They improved constantly, learning from every encounter, adapting their tactics, getting better every week. And they kept coming. No matter how many American planes the Japanese shot down, more appeared the next day. The supply seemed inexhaustible, an endless stream of aircraft and pilots from bases that Japanese bombers could not reach. The Americans were fighting a war of attrition, and Japan was losing. The transformation accelerated when the Americans introduced new aircraft designed specifically to counter Japanese advantages. In September 1943, a new fighter appeared over the Pacific, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. It was everything the Zero was not: big, heavy, armored, with a 2,000 horsepower engine that gave it speed and climb rate the Zero could not match. Japanese pilots called it a rude awakening. The Hellcat could absorb hits that would have destroyed a Zero and keep flying. It could dive away from any engagement with speed the Zero could not match. It carried 6 50 caliber machine guns capable of tearing apart the lightly built Japanese fighters with a 2-second burst. Most devastatingly, the Hellcat was easy to fly. The Americans could train pilots quickly in it and put them into combat with reasonable confidence. They would survive long enough to learn. The Zero demanded years of training to master. The Hellcat demanded months. The F4U Corsair arrived around the same time, another powerful fighter that overmatched Japanese aircraft. Marine and Navy squadrons equipped with these new planes began achieving kill ratios that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Where the Guadalcanal fighting had been roughly even, engagements in 1943 increasingly became one-sided American victories. Japanese veterans noticed the change immediately. The tactics that had worked against Wildcats failed against Hellcats. The Americans would not engage in turning fights where the Zero might have an advantage. They made high-speed passes from altitude, fired and dove away before Japanese pilots could respond. They fought as pairs and flights, covering each other, never allowing themselves to be isolated. Sakai, who returned to limited duty in 1944 after his wounds partially healed, found a different war than the one he had left. Putting a kid with only about 20 hours flight time into a plane and telling him to take on American pilots in Hellcats and Corsairs is just as much a suicidal tactic as being a kamikaze, he later said. We figured that if they are going to die anyway, the kamikaze attack will probably cause more damage to the enemy for the same price in lives. That was the brutal calculus Japanese command had reached. They could no longer win conventional air battles. The only option was to trade lives directly for ships. The catastrophic Japanese pilot losses could be traced to a fundamental strategic miscalculation the Japanese leadership never corrected. A failure so profound that it determined the outcome of the Pacific Air War more than any single battle. Japan had entered the war with approximately 6,000 trained pilots, of whom about 900 were considered experts capable of the most demanding combat missions. This was a force built for a short, decisive conflict, the kind of war Japan had fought against China and Russia. Japanese planners expected to win quickly, to knock America out of the war with a devastating opening blow before its industrial might could be mobilized. The entire strategy depended on American willingness to negotiate after suffering initial defeats. When that did not happen, when America responded to Pearl Harbor with determination rather than despair, the pilot shortage became critical. The problem was structural, built into the very foundations of how Japan approached military aviation. Japanese pilot training had been designed to produce an elite force, small in number but exceptional in quality, The rigorous selection process eliminated all but the most talented candidates. The lengthy training program, lasting years rather than months, produced superb aviators but could not scale up to meet wartime demands. American pilot training expanded massively after Pearl Harbor, growing from a modest peacetime program to an industrial-scale operation. The United States eventually trained nearly 200,000 pilots during the war, drawing from a civilian population that already had widespread exposure to automobiles, motorcycles, and mechanical systems. American teenagers had grown up tinkering with engines. Many had driven cars or trucks. Some had even flown civilian aircraft before enlisting. This mechanical familiarity provided a foundation that Japanese recruits often lacked. American flight schools operated around the clock, processing wave after wave of candidates through standardized training programs. The curriculum was efficient, designed to produce competent combat pilots as quickly as possible without sacrificing essential skills. Primary training took 10 weeks. Intermediate training added 11 more. Advanced training for fighter pilots took another 6 weeks, followed by operational training with combat units. The training pipeline never stopped flowing. Every month, hundreds of new pilots graduated and shipped out to operational squadrons. Every month, experienced pilots rotated home from combat zones to serve as instructors, passing their hard-won knowledge to the next generation. The system was designed for a long war of attrition, exactly the kind of war Japan could not afford to fight. Japan graduated only 46,000 pilots during the entire war, less than a quarter of the American total. Nearly half of those came in 1944, rushed through abbreviated programs that produced aviators with dangerously inadequate skills. The rigorous selection and training that had made Japanese pilots the best in the world at the war's beginning was abandoned out of necessity. There was simply no time to train pilots properly when replacements were needed immediately. By early 1945, Japanese Navy pilots were graduating with as little as 40 hours of flight time. Some had never fired their guns in practice. A few had never made a carrier landing until they were assigned to a combat unit. Their American opponents had at least 525 hours of flight time before they ever saw combat, with extensive training in gunnery, navigation, and formation tactics. The experienced veterans who had dominated the early war were systematically destroyed through attrition. Unlike the Americans, Japan did not rotate successful pilots home to train replacements. They flew until they died. The combat experience that took years to accumulate vanished in seconds when an ace was shot down. Japanese commanders recognized the problem but could not solve it. Every experienced pilot lost represented years of investment that could not be replaced. But withdrawing veterans from combat to serve as instructors would weaken frontline squadrons at critical moments. The Japanese chose to keep their best pilots fighting, gambling that their skill would offset American numerical advantages. The gamble failed. One by one, Japan's aces fell. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, considered by many the greatest Japanese fighter pilot of the war, was killed when his transport plane was shot down in October 1944. He had survived 4 years of combat only to die as a passenger. Tetsuo Iwamoto, credited with over 80 victories, was wounded and sidelined. The roster of experienced pilots grew shorter with each passing month. The Americans faced casualties too, but their system was designed to absorb losses. When an American squadron lost pilots, replacements arrived within weeks, trained to a consistent standard, ready to integrate into existing formations. When a Japanese squadron lost pilots, the replacements were often barely qualified to fly, let alone fight against experienced opponents. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa recognized the problem when he assembled Japan's remaining carrier strength for what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. His pilots were largely inexperienced, products of the truncated training programs that had replaced the rigorous pre-war system. Many had never made a carrier landing. Some had never dropped a torpedo. A few had barely mastered basic formation flying. Ozawa hoped that land-based aircraft from Guam and other islands would supplement his weakness. His strategy depended on using the longer range of Japanese aircraft to strike the Americans before American planes could reach his carriers. He would launch his strikes from outside American range, recover his planes on Guam to refuel and rearm, then launch again. The mathematics seemed promising on paper. But Ozawa did not know that American submarines had been tracking his fleet since it left anchorage. He did not know that American codebreakers had revealed his plan. And he did not know just how badly outclassed his pilots were about to be. What followed became known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On June 19, 1944, Ozawa launched his first strike wave shortly after dawn. 200 raid planes, including Zero fighters, D-4Y Judy dive bombers, and B-6N Jill torpedo bombers, formed up over the Japanese fleet and headed toward the American task force approximately 300 miles away. American radar operators detected the incoming strike at extreme range, over 150 miles out. This gave the fighter directors aboard the American carriers time to vector their combat air patrol to intercept. Within minutes, dozens of F6F Hellcats were climbing toward the incoming Japanese formation. The inexperienced Japanese pilots flew into a slaughter. Trained to attack aggressively, they charged in small, uncoordinated groups, rather than forming up for a mass assault that might have overwhelmed the American defenses. They came in at predictable altitudes, following doctrines that had worked against weaker opponents but proved suicidal against prepared defenses. American fighter directors, a new addition to the fleet that had been lacking in earlier battles, calmly vectored Hellcats to intercept each wave with devastating precision. The Japanese pilots, many facing combat for the first time, found themselves outmaneuvered and outflown by American veterans who had months or years of experience. The Hellcats dove through the Japanese formations, scattering the attackers, picking off bombers before they could reach their targets. The few Japanese pilots who made it through the fighter screen faced a wall of anti-aircraft fire from the American ships, including a new weapon called the proximity fuse that detonated near targets without requiring a direct hit. The results were catastrophic. Of the first wave of 69 aircraft, 42 were shot down. The second wave lost 97 of 130 aircraft. The third wave fared slightly better, losing only 7 of 47 planes, but achieved nothing. The fourth wave lost 82 of 82 aircraft, a total annihilation. By nightfall, Japan had lost nearly 300 aircraft. American losses were about 30 planes. The kill ratio approached 10-1, a margin of victory so overwhelming that it defied belief. One American pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrasiu of Fighting Squadron 16, shot down 6 Japanese planes in 8 minutes during the battle. When asked to pose for photographers afterward, he held up 6 fingers and grinned. "It was just like an old-time turkey shoot," he said. The phrase stuck and became the battle's unofficial name. But the Japanese pilots had not lacked courage. They pressed their attacks despite catastrophic losses. They flew into walls of anti-aircraft fire that shredded their formations. They died by the hundreds trying to reach the American fleet. Many of those who reached striking distance released their weapons too early or at poor angles, the errors of inexperience compounded by the chaos of combat. What they lacked was skill, experience, and aircraft that could match their opponents. The pre-war Japanese pilot, with his 700 hours of training and years of combat experience, would have been a formidable opponent in any era. The 1944 Japanese pilot, with perhaps 100 hours of flight time and no combat experience, was simply outmatched. American submarines added to the destruction. The USS Albacore torpedoed Ozawa's flagship, the carrier Taiho, the newest and largest carrier in the Japanese fleet. Inexperienced damage control crews failed to contain the resulting fuel vapor leak. 6 hours later, a massive explosion ripped the ship apart. 1,500 men died. The USS Kavala found the carrier Shokaku, one of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor nearly 3 years earlier. 3 torpedoes struck home. Fires raged out of control, reached the aviation fuel storage, and detonated the bomb magazines. The Shokaku went down with over 1,200 men. By the time the battle ended, Japan had lost 3 aircraft carriers and nearly 600 aircraft, along with hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. The American fleet had lost 123 aircraft, mostly in the desperate long-range strike on the second day, when planes ran out of fuel returning to their carriers. But most of those American pilots were rescued from the water. Japan had lost nearly everything. The defeat shattered Japan's naval aviation as a fighting force. The carriers that survived had no trained pilots to fly from their decks. Within months, many of those same ships would serve as decoys. Empty platforms meant to draw American attention while the remnants of Japan's surface fleet made a desperate attack at Leyte Gulf. The pilots who survived the Marianas disaster found themselves facing an impossible situation. They could no longer win in conventional combat. The Americans had better planes, better pilots, and seemingly inexhaustible numbers. Every month, more carriers joined the American fleet. Every month, more Hellcats and Corsairs rolled off assembly lines. Japanese command responded with the kamikaze. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi organized the first official special attack units in October 1944. The concept was straightforward. Since Japanese pilots could not survive long enough to make multiple attacks, they would make one final attack count. They would crash their bomb-laden aircraft directly into American ships. The decision represented the complete inversion of everything Japanese pilots had believed at the war's beginning. They had entered the conflict confident in their superiority, certain that their skill would prevail. Now they were being asked to die not because they were better than the Americans, but because they were not. Sakai was among the veterans who viewed the strategy with barely concealed disgust. "All that stuff you read about dying for the Emperor, Banzai, that is all crap," he said later. There was not one kamikaze pilot or soldier out there who was thinking anything about the Emperor when they were facing death. They were thinking about their mother and their family, just like anybody else. The reason those final letters home that they wrote are so filled with Emperor glorification stuff is because they knew the censors would read them, and because they simply wanted to try to make their parents proud. The kamikaze attacks killed over 7,000 American sailors and damaged or sank dozens of ships. But they did not turn the tide. American damage control teams learned to save ships that would have been lost earlier in the war. Combat air patrols shot down most attackers before they could reach their targets. The attacks did accomplish one thing. They demonstrated to the Americans that Japanese pilots, however outmatched, would not surrender. They would fight to the death. That realization shaped American planning for the invasion of Japan's home islands. Military planners estimated that an invasion of Japan would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties, in part because they expected the same fanatical resistance that kamikaze pilots had shown. This calculation contributed to the decision to use atomic weapons rather than attempt a conventional invasion. The war ended on August 15, 1945, with Japan's surrender. In the years that followed, Japanese veterans grappled with what they had experienced. The beliefs they had carried into war, the certainty of Japanese superiority, the contempt for American fighting ability, all of it had been proven catastrophically wrong. Some veterans, like Sakai, became advocates for reconciliation. After the war, Sakai retired from the Navy and became a Buddhist acolyte, vowing never to kill anything that lived, even a mosquito. He met with American veterans, including some he had fought against. In 1970, he attended a meeting of the American Fighter Aces Association in San Diego. A P-51 Mustang pilot approached him through an interpreter. "Please tell Saburo that I read his book twice," the American said. "The feelings that he described were the same that I felt in combat. I am glad that we can share that understanding." Sakai accepted the reconciliation with characteristic honesty about what he had learned. After riding in a P-51 Mustang years after the war, he admitted that his beloved Zero was no longer number one with him. The Mustang could do things the Zero never could. It was, he acknowledged, a superior aircraft. That admission would have been unthinkable in 1941, when Japanese pilots believed their spirit would overcome any material disadvantage. The war had taught them otherwise. It had taught them that the Americans they had dismissed as soft and decadent would fight with skill, courage, and relentless determination. Takeshi Maeda, a pilot who had launched torpedoes at Pearl Harbor, became one of the most dedicated advocates for reconciliation between Japan and America. He returned to Hawaii multiple times, spoke at memorial ceremonies, and developed close friendships with American veterans who had been on the ships he attacked. "War is between countries," he explained. "It has nothing to do with us as individuals. We have no quarrel. So when the war ends, of course you should make up." In 2006, Maeda participated in a handshake reconciliation service with John Rauschkolb, a Navy signalman who had been aboard the USS West Virginia when Maeda's torpedo helped sink it. Rauschkolb had to swim under burning fuel while Japanese planes strafed the water around him. Yet decades later, he told reporters, "I have never held anything against them. They were doing their job. I was doing my job. We were military. They were taking orders. I was taking orders." That capacity for mutual respect, forged in the crucible of combat and preserved through decades of peace, stands as one of the war's most remarkable legacies. Saburo Sakai died on September 22, 2000, at age 84. He was attending a formal dinner at Atsugi Naval Air Station as a guest of the United States Navy when he collapsed from a heart attack. American officers rushed to help him, but he was gone. He had lived long enough to see his former enemies become his closest allies, long enough to acknowledge that American pilots had been worthy opponents who had earned his respect through their courage and skill, long enough to reject the poisonous ideology of racial superiority that had led his nation into war. His memoir, Samurai, remains one of the most widely read accounts of aerial combat in the Pacific. It presents the war from a perspective rarely seen in Western histories, that of a Japanese pilot who started the war believing in his nation's inevitable victory and ended it understanding exactly why Japan lost. The transformation in Japanese perceptions of American pilots between 1941 and 1945 represents one of history's most dramatic shifts in military assessment. Japanese aviators began the war convinced they faced an inferior enemy. They ended it knowing they had faced pilots who matched them in courage and exceeded them in resources, training systems, and tactical adaptation. That knowledge came at a terrible price. Japan lost approximately 40,000 pilots during the war, many in the final desperate months when undertrained young men were sent to die against overwhelming American superiority. The legacy survives in unexpected ways. At Atsugi Naval Air Station, where Sakai died, American and Japanese aviators now trained side by side. The alliance between former enemies has become one of the most durable in the world. Former Japanese pilots who once believed Americans would never fight have watched their grandchildren serve alongside Americans in joint exercises that would have been unimaginable in 1942. The story of how Japanese pilots learned to respect American aviators is ultimately a story about the destruction of dangerous myths. The belief in inherent racial or spiritual superiority, the contempt for enemies based on propaganda rather than evidence, the assumption that will alone can overcome material reality, all of these ideas were tested in the skies over Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, and Okinawa. They failed. The failure was complete and undeniable. Japanese pilots who had expected easy victory found themselves outmatched in aircraft, tactics, training systems, and eventually in numbers so overwhelming that individual skill ceased to matter. The Americans they had dismissed as inferior proved to be formidable opponents who fought with tenacity, adapted with intelligence, and improved with relentless determination. What replaced the myths of superiority was something more durable, a recognition that courage exists on both sides of any conflict, that bravery is not the monopoly of any nation or race, that skill must be earned through training and experience, not assumed through birth or cultural superiority, that the enemy you dismiss as weak may surprise you with strength you never imagined. The transformation required Japan's defeat, but it also required the willingness of survivors on both sides to reflect honestly on what they had experienced. Veterans like Saburo Sakai, Takeshi Maeda, Zenji Abe, and Kaname Harada chose to spend their post-war lives building bridges rather than nursing grievances. They traveled to America, met with former enemies, and acknowledged publicly that their opponents had been worthy adversaries. American veterans reciprocated. Men who had watched friends die at Japanese hands found it within themselves to shake hands with the pilots who might have killed them. The shared experience of aerial combat, the understanding that both sides had faced death with courage, created a bond that transcended the hatreds of war. This reconciliation was not universal. Many veterans on both sides could never forgive what they had experienced. The Pacific War had been brutal in ways that the European theatre often was not, marked by atrocities, racial hatred, and a mutual willingness to show no quarter. Some wounds never healed, but enough healing occurred to transform wartime adversaries into peacetime partners. The United States and Japan built one of the strongest military partnerships in the world, a relationship that would have seemed impossible to the pilots who faced each other over Guadalcanal. Japanese and American aviators now train together, fly together, and plan together for the defense of shared interests. Saburo Sakai understood this better than most. Years after the war, he reflected on what combat had taught him about himself and his enemies. The first fight, I did not remember anything or understand anything. With every fight, I became stronger. The Americans were the same. They all wanted to win. Combat makes the pilot's will to win stronger. In the end, they were not so different. The Japanese pilot who had expected easy victory and the American pilots who refused to give him one. They were young men, far from home, fighting for their countries, testing themselves against each other in the most unforgiving arena imaginable. They climbed into their cockpits knowing that each flight might be their last. They watched friends die in burning aircraft. They lived with fear and pushed through it to do what their nations asked of them. Some survived, most did not.